Something has happened to Robbie Wolfe since he replaced Frank Fritz on American Pickers. Fans have been really mad about it. So why are people so upset? Let's go through what happened and tell you the real story about Robbie Wolfe. Robbie Wolfe took over as the co-host of American Pickers from Frank Fritz. Before that, Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz were the main stars for many years. The way they got along on screen, their jokes, their shared memories, and the connection they built over many years was what made the show so popular. But there was something else viewers really liked. Robbie was already a familiar face on the show. At first, he only showed up sometimes, but he appeared more often as Frank showed up less. When viewers saw the brother connection on camera, people reacted differently. Some thought it was nice to keep it in the family, and others thought it was unfair favoritism. This is where Robbie's trouble started. The show's ratings dropped badly, and people blamed Robbie. How is Robbie responsible for the drop in ratings? Before we tell you, let us give you background information. It started in 2020 when Frank Fritz stopped appearing on American Pickers. Fans were really surprised and wanted to know what happened. Frank had been Mike's partner since the show started. For him to disappear like that, fans thought something was definitely wrong. Fans hoped Frank would come back. Then came the really bad news. Frank was not coming back. The news that Frank wouldn't return made fans really angry because they'd been emotionally connected to the two hosts for over 10 years. For many viewers, Frank wasn't just a co-host. He was what made the show special. Sure, Frank was a bit rough and didn't have Mike's smooth style. But what he lacked in smoothness, he made up for with surprising kindness and great chemistry with Mike. Frank was the perfect opposite to Mike's energy. For the audience, Frank not being there was going to be a huge loss. At first, the story was Frank left because of health problems. But then rumors started spreading. Yes, Frank struggled with health problems. He had a really bad back injury that wouldn't heal. The heavy lifting on the show over the years had taken a terrible toll. Frank dealt with the pain before deciding to have surgery. During recovery, Frank faced a serious problem. To help with pain, Frank was given prescription painkillers. According to Mike, the painkillers worked too well. Mike said Frank became addicted and this hurt their friendship. They barely spoke and slowly grew apart. Mike said he wasn't going to give up on his friend and organized an intervention with family and friends. But Frank pushed back. The drugs had taken complete control. Mike said Frank's addiction got worse over time. His behavior changed, and his friendships fell apart. According to Mike, the man people loved on screen started disappearing behind pain and drug withdrawal. So Mike said producers couldn't count on Frank and had to remove him from the show and bring in Mike's brother, Robbie. However, fans aren't agreeing with Mike at all. They said he was a terrible friend to Frank. They wonder why Mike waited until Frank died before talking about Frank's addiction. They said he was willing to say anything to help ratings, even if it meant saying bad things about Frank. They even threatened to stop watching because of how Mike treated Frank's memory. The pressure on Mike and Robbie grew. But here's where things get surprising. Frank does have an addiction problem. So were Mike's statements actually true? In July 2021, Frank told the Sun newspaper that he had a drinking problem. At first, Frank ignored it and buried himself in work. But after surgery, Frank had a realization. He wanted more from life and to live longer than his mother, who died from a disease that alcohol caused. His grandfather was also addicted to alcohol. Frank checked into an Iowa rehab for 77 days and stayed sober for 11 months before drinking again briefly. His honesty earned sympathy. So fans think if Frank had a painkiller addiction, he would have talked about it. Or had his addiction taken over, as Mike said? Or was Mike trying to make Frank look bad because of what Frank revealed? Frank revealed that he and Mike didn't talk for 2 years. He said Mike didn't even check on him after surgery. Could this be true? However, that wasn't Frank's biggest revelation. Frank talked about the real reason he was kicked off. Frank didn't give details, but it seemed Mike wasn't comfortable with Frank's growing popularity. Frank had charm that audiences couldn't resist. They loved his effort and humor. The audience believed Frank really cared about the show, and it wasn't just about money. Frank knew the history of each item. For the audience, it was a fun way of learning. When Frank cleaned up his diet and lost weight, it seemed Mike had a problem with that. Frank believed Mike worked behind the scenes to remove him so Robbie could take his place. Frank said clearly, "I think Mike wants to get his brother Robbie in there to replace me." That quote got repeated everywhere. The idea of a beloved co-host being pushed aside while a host's family member benefited felt like betrayal. Mike said this wasn't true, that it was Frank's addiction talking. In July 2022, Frank had a really bad stroke and never fully recovered. He had to go to the hospital several times after that. He died on September 30th, 2024 at age 60. After his death, fans asked whether Frank had been treated fairly when he needed understanding. For many fans, sadness mixed with suspicion and anger, and the target was Robbie. Mike said Frank's comment made him reach out to Frank, and he forgave him. Was Frank really lying? Whatever the truth, Frank's presence still haunts the show. The audience still wants his laughter, jokes, and emotional openness. He built a connection between the screen and viewers' hearts. Now that he's gone, fans hold onto his memory and compare everyone against it. Frank has left a huge shadow that has covered up Robbie. Can Robbie get out of this shadow? A large group of fans think Robbie doesn't belong on the show. Critics watched episodes with Frank and ones Robbie co-hosted. They decided Frank was warm and his warmth was important. They feel Robbie is too stiff and business-focused. They believe Robbie got the job because of favoritism and doesn't care enough. They say Robbie doesn't know antiques like Frank did. But what does knowing antiques mean? For Frank, it was life experience, deep knowledge of unusual items, and a personality that let him be both blunt and kind with sellers. Frank knew the stories of items. But Robbie's background is different. Robbie came from business. He had a landscaping and restoration business. His experience shaped how he works as a picker. Robbie is often shown making deals, moving inventory, and running operations. Fans who valued Frank's storytelling see Robbie's style as just business transactions. His critics say he's boring and has awkward conversations with customers. When Robbie is careful with offers, critics say he's being cheap. They claim Robbie pushes harder with sellers, and that's why ratings dropped. To them, Robbie is an example of how not to be a picker. Is that fair to Robbie? Robbie might not have Frank's ability to tell stories, but he's living his best life as co-host. Growing up the youngest of 3 children in Bettendorf, Iowa, Robbie describes himself as a restless kid. He wasn't the best student. People thought he wouldn't be anyone special, let alone a TV star. But Robbie had wild imagination. His mother understood this and gave him freedom to explore. She gave him and his siblings what they needed to live a good life, even if it meant sacrificing herself. Robbie put his imagination to good use. In his mind, he was Huck Finn, floating downstream on a raft, discovering hidden corners of America. That adventurous spirit stayed with him. While his mom let his mind run wild, his grandfather, William Wolfe, a junk collector on Chicago's South Side, pointed him toward collecting junk. His grandfather collected toilets, doors, and other things in his yard. He taught Robbie to appreciate everything. Robbie took that lesson to heart, even beyond what his grandfather expected. Unlike his grandfather, who bought things thinking about resale value, Robbie bought things because they caught his eye. While his goal was to eventually sell, Robbie didn't rush. He didn't care how long it took. As long as he liked something, he'd keep it. Is Robbie truly not about money? Have critics been unfair? There's an answer. Robbie decided to follow the path of collecting junk, but he had a plan. Robbie bought a 3,722 square foot house with 4 bedrooms and bathrooms in 2017 for around $335,000. On the business side, he bought over 6 acres of land for $80,000 around 2020. He bought adjacent land, a former auto building in Davenport, Iowa, for around $200,000. In March 2021, he made repairs, electrical upgrades, turning it into a warehouse for vintage vehicles and collectibles, spending $25,655 on renovations. Robbie wasn't just storing antiques. He restored them. He's worked on neon signs, motorcycles, classic cars, gas pumps, and vintage trailers. His life is all about vintage items. No wonder he feels at home on American Pickers. However, Robbie might be too business-focused. He doesn't care much about beauty. Robbie's philosophy leans toward making objects work rather than look perfectly restored. Things he worked on might not be pretty, but Robbie didn't mind as long as they worked. Robbie might not know how to tell stories, but he's living in one. He says he knows the value of stories, something he learned growing up. He grew to love learning about stories of people, their families, and objects. If he loves stories, why didn't he learn to be a better storyteller? Or is he better than critics say? Robbie says he's passionate about picking and wants a legacy beyond his picks. He's given tips on picking. He advises pickers to be people persons. He says the best picker listens to stories people tell about their things. To Robbie, it's not just about spotting value. It's understanding memory, emotion, heritage. A dusty chest isn't valuable because of price, but because of who touched it, how many hands it passed through, the stories woven into its marks. Yet critics argue this doesn't turn into dramatic storytelling on camera like Frank did. Robbie continues giving advice for pickers. He criticizes pickers who treat artifacts as money-driven. In his 2025 Koval's Antique Trader interview, Robbie spoke of the Rust Belt Americana show and its charitable work. The event runs across states, bringing car and antique lovers together. Money raised supports scholarships and grants for blue-collar students and teachers. Robbie suggests people should give back. He sees his actions as teaching by example, but doesn't want to be on a pedestal. He wants to build bridges and connect with people. Isn't this what Frank did? Like Frank, Robbie says he's always on the road. About 10 days monthly, he's searching barns, meeting sellers, looking at items, and bargaining. Facing harsh weather, breakdowns, missed calls, and stress are part of the job. Cameras capture pics, but rarely the calls he misses or nights he lies awake wondering if he overpaid. There's loneliness, tiredness, and unpredictability. Sometimes Robbie drives about 50,000 miles yearly pursuing new finds. That constant movement could be what fans see as tiredness or stiffness on camera. Even filming is hard work. Robbie believes capturing finds makes work extra difficult. Cameras follow him digging stuff out of barns, garages, and basements. What took 6 hours became 12 hours. Despite longer hours, it's not enough for 42 minutes of television. They need 300 hours of filming in 100-degree heat, sometimes 6 different sessions with different people. Robbie keeps relationships with friends. They buy from him, and he buys from them. According to him, their crew has become like family. Their camera and sound guys have been there since season 1. Now, they're over 24 seasons and don't look like they're parting ways soon. The only important person who left is Frank, but his absence feels like a haunting presence. Robbie plans to spend years on the show, even if it means arguing with his brother. They can be stubborn. Sometimes Robbie gets his way, other times Mike does. At day's end, they try to look past differences and make the best show they can. Robbie is having the time of his life, and the stress seems worth it because of what he finds. One favorite find was a 1941 Indian motorcycle in a Michigan house basement. The house belonged to a World War II pilot who'd built a plane in that basement. His daughter hadn't visited in a decade. Robbie found a motorcycle, scattered parts, and a plane body. The house's back wall had to be removed to get the airplane out. In that moment, the object was less valuable than the story. The pilot's daughter cried, talking about flights, family dinners, loss, and war memories. Robbie says that's his favorite kind of pick, where the artifact cannot be separated from the story. Robbie loves bikes. He treats motorcycles like old friends. He doesn't just see bikes as machines. He sees lives and histories. He buys bikes to hear what they whisper. It's just that he can't tell the stories he hears.